Does your world hurt your characters? Does it hinder them? Does it favor some people but crush others? And most importantly, when something big happens, does your world and story remember? Most writers think that world building is about inventing systems. But systems don't make a world feel real. Consequences do. If your world doesn't meaningfully affect character decisions, emotional arcs, or story stakes, then it's not world building. It's setting backdrop. Because your world isn't defined by what it allows. It's defined by what it costs. And if your setting doesn't cost your characters anything, it will never feel real, no matter how cool or interesting the lore is. So in this video, I'll be focusing on world building through consequences. So how to build settings and systems, focusing on cause, effect, and memory, so you can avoid tiring exposition dumps, and make your world automatically generate story tension, character behavior, and plot momentum. Here's the golden standard. Everything you introduce should cost something, and cost should stack. Each consequence should escalate tension, tighten the noose, and push the story towards a bigger payoff by the climax of the book or by the end of each act, pushing the plot towards the next act. Don't introduce plot points for pure spectacle or shock and then drop them. Every major beat is a promise. The world will respond, the characters will adapt, and the story will remember. So, when should you use this approach? This method shines especially in fantasy, sci-fi, action, mystery, or suspense. Basically anything driven by danger, systems, strategy, politics, survival, and secrets. So, how to achieve this standard? A world feels real when it has rules, so what's possible and what's allowed, pressure, so what people must do to survive socially or physically, costs, so price tags, and memory, so the aftermath and permanence of the consequences. And we'll unpack each of these through 7 practical rules. Rule number 1, teach the rule by showing the penalty. So what do I mean by rules? These can include magic systems, laws, power structures, social expectations, economies, religion, and geographies. You want to first find the rules that actually collide with your characters, and focus on how you integrate them naturally into the narrative. These even exist in real life, and they can come as a culture shock, like drug possession in certain Southeast Asian countries that can lead to the death penalty. The point here is that your normal is not universal. So 2 ways to communicate this rule. First, you can either state the rules out loud and show the consequences when a character breaks them, but usually this is for when a rule is going to be broken later on in the book and never immediately. Like when Harry Potter enters Hogwarts and certain rules are established, but they're broken later on in the book. Or, what we'll be focusing on in this section, you can show the readers the rule by first showing the characters break them. In Squid Game, the characters don't enter the game knowing what's at stake. Instead, during the very first game, red light, green light, when several characters don't freeze in time, they're instantly killed off. The penalty immediately teaches the rule. Now the audience understands the system emotionally because the world punished a mistake. Failure equals death. But the rules don't have to be so extreme. They can scale from small scenes to epic scope. It could even be something like breaking a social rule in a high school pecking order and getting punished through reputation damage and exclusion. The fastest way to communicate a world rule is violation leads to consequence leads to behavior change. The audience learns through danger. This can also help to avoid infodumps because consequences are visible. In essence, you want this scene to teach the rule. Some crucial tips here. First, focus on the rules relevant to the character. Choose a couple or a handful of rules that will actually corner your protagonist into decisions. If a rule never forces a choice, threatens a value, or makes the protagonist change tactics, then it's flavor, and you should treat it as flavor. This means you want intentionality. World details should matter to the plot, the theme, and character development and decisions, so link them together. And once you've established the rule, don't stop at this is how it works. The next step is asking, what does this rule do to society? And what does it force people to do to survive? The second tip is to remember to keep consistent, logical rules. You don't want to create a system with rules that only exist when the plot remembers them. If the consequences are inconsistent, sometimes brutally enforced and sometimes ignored, then the audience stops theorizing. Game of Thrones is a perfect example of how breaking your own rules kills consequence world building. Earlier, it's established that the whites are limited by water, but by the final season, when the story needs them to win, suddenly they're capable of pulling a dragon out of a frozen lake. The problem isn't fantasy logic. It's that the world stops enforcing consistent boundaries, so danger feels arbitrary instead of earned. You see the same issue through the later seasons when travel time, army logistics, and weapon effectiveness suddenly change depending on what the plot needs that episode. Stranger Things also shows how weakening a rule weakens fear and suspense. In the earlier seasons, the Upside Down feels hostile, like you don't belong there and being inside it is a serious risk. But as the show goes on, and especially in the later seasons, characters start to treat the Upside Down more like a normal location. They no longer have breathing problems and the scary factor is gone. When the environment stops charging a price, the world feels less dangerous, so tension drops. Rule number 2, turn the rule into pressure. Pressure is what people must do to survive socially or physically. A rule becomes real when it creates incentives and punishments that shape daily behavior. This is when the world stops being a shallow backdrop and starts acting like a force with opinions. It helps some people and crushes others. Pressure creates a story's decision points, so scenes naturally become negotiation, risks, trade-offs, and sacrifices instead of random events. Rules create winners and losers, so the world starts to automatically generate conflict. And pressure becomes visible through laws, policing, rituals, taboos, class structures, propaganda, and black markets. Think, what happens if a character does nothing? The world closes in. Who enforces the rules? Is it the institution, leaders, culture, or physics? Who benefits from the rules staying in place? The winners. And who's trapped by it? The losers. Once you know that, conflict isn't something that you add, it's built into the setting. In Dune, spice isn't just valuable, it's structural. It controls travel, power, and survival, so every alliance and betrayal has urgency baked into it. In Arcane, Piltover's comfort is built on Zaun's suffering, so every solution creates backlash, and every character choice is political whether they want it to be or not. In Harry Potter, the Ministry's rules don't just exist, they create a constant threat. What can I do without getting punished? And that pressure shapes how the characters hide, lie, and act. Pressure is what forces character behavior, and cost is what makes behavior painful. Rule number 3, cost. Put a daily price tag on living there. Think of costs as price tags, what it takes from the character, how it hurts them, and how it hinders them. And daily price tags are what does living here cost in money, time, safety, dignity, and morality. Cost should be felt in scenes, not just explained. Like I mentioned before, the world isn't defined by what it allows, but by what it costs. And while there can be big consequences such as trials, you can also show it in the day-to-day life. Cost can be physical, social, economical, moral, and psychological. In Dune, water is established as a crucial resource in a seemingly desert planet. It turns basic human life into economics and rituals. Hydration, sweat, and even death become resources the culture has to manage. In Arcane, Shimmer isn't just a drug, it's an economic ladder and a trap. The solution to the powerlessness becomes another form of control. In the Stormlight Archive, we learn that power is tied to a consumable resource, so stormlight, which turns magic into logistics. In Trust of the Emerald Sea, the environment is a daily cost. The Spore Seas turn travel into a constant risk management problem. It forces behavior, routines, equipment choices, and social rules, because one mistake isn't just inconvenient, it leads to death. And in my upcoming book, I build a world built off of favors. There's no money involved, but if you want something, you need to trade a power. Taking this into account also prevents obstacle course world building. So when the setting is just a string of arbitrary hurdles, it stops feeling like a lived-in world and starts feeling like the author is forcing challenges into the story. Rule number 4, make it personal. Integrate setting into the character. So how does this world shape them? Like we mentioned, the world actively hurts and hinders them. So you want to understand the character's relationship to the world to make the events and consequences feel personal. You want to connect with the emotional. First, you need to understand that not everyone experiences consequences equally, and some people don't experience the same ones as others. Consequences apply differently based on background, rich versus poor, royalty versus commoner, levels of authority and power, and status can lead to exemptions. Personality factors, such as tolerance levels, since not everyone reacts the same way, risk-taking, experience, so someone who constantly gets punished might not brush it off as easily as a goody two-shoes. When consequences hit, characters' reactions diverge because they have different hidden fears, inner wants, and methods. And consequences can also apply differently based off of context. Time, place, and political climate change how hard the world enforces its rules. What's fine in a private moment becomes deadly in public. What's tolerated in peacetime becomes punishable in a crackdown. That's why the same action can have completely different consequences depending on where the character is and who's watching. And when talking about consequence world building, designing character is as important as designing the world itself, since the consequences affect the characters, and characters react differently based off of these factors. And then you need to understand how these costs shape characters. You want to connect world building to character behavior. You can use setting as trauma or training. So ask yourself, what did this place teach them is normal? Does this world make them feel like they belong, or do they feel alienated? In Harry Potter, Malfoy is uptight and arrogant because the world has trained him to know that these rules protect him. He expects exceptions, influence, and rescue. So when consequences finally land on him, it's not just plot, it's identity shock. And in Lord of the Rings, Frodo isn't just affected physically. The moral cost changes who he is, and that's part of why the world feels heavy. You can also see this in the cases of mirrors, how the exact same circumstances can shape characters differently. Remember that mirrors are characters who share the same core want or background but make different choices, highlighting who each could have been. These differences can stem from personal and plot factors, but it can also stem from the world's cost itself. In Arcane, Vi and Powder grow up under the same conditions, but the costs hit them differently, so their coping strategies and eventual choices split hard. Vi learns that strength and aggression are survival tools because Zahn punishes softness. Meanwhile, Jinx learns the opposite lesson, that being weak gets people hurt, so she chases usefulness and control until it turns destructive. Piltover characters can treat danger like theory, while Zahn characters live inside consequences daily, so even when they share goals, their methods clash. And how the characters are affected by the cost drives plot, because this world building helps create character decisions. Note that you can even assign world building consequences to supporting characters as narrative jobs. So someone who represents the institution, someone who pays a cost, someone who tempts, someone who warns. I went over these narrative jobs in my previous video about shaping characters. So, once consequences shape people, the next question is, do they stick? Rule number 5, memory. Cause creates effect, and that should lead to memory. Memory is the aftermath and permanence of the consequences. The world shouldn't reset after big events or go on as if nothing happened. If you raise the stakes through consequences, don't ignore them later. You have to have them pay off. And like I mentioned, avoid spectacle and shock value events that get dropped and are never mentioned again. This is very important since it's a big downfall of a lot of major shows. And dropped consequences can look like a character survives something that should permanently change how people treat them, but by the next episode nobody mentions it. Or major powers are introduced as terrifying, then later they're used casually with no trade-off. Or a massive reveal happens, but it doesn't alter alliances, tactics, or character behavior going forward. That's when the world stops remembering, and the audience stops trusting the stakes. Everything should build and stack into bigger tension and payoff. It should change the plot moving forward, character behavior and development, politics, or relationships. Consequences should stack into rising tension towards late Act 2 or the climax of Act 3, and have meaningful plot impact. In Lord of the Rings, the event leaves scars even when evil is defeated. Victory doesn't resolve what was lost. The Shire changes. Frodo carries scars, so there's long-term aftermath and not an immediate fallout. And the Dune series is a masterclass in consequence world building. Ecology leads to religion, leads to politics. In Book 1, Paul's rise doesn't save Arrakis. It destabilizes everything. Religion hardens into ideology, and even ecology faces a massive shift. By Book 4, because of Leto II's actions, you even see a desert planet turn green. And that ecological shift isn't just background, it becomes a crisis. Changing Arrakis threatens the sandworm cycle, destabilizes the spice economy, and turns the environment itself into the center of political and religious conflict. Because in Dune, it's never really a victory, it's a trade-off. Temporary solution that comes at the price of the world keeps collecting. Environment is never neutral, and one choice reshapes belief and empire logic. Rule number 6. Past, present, and future. Creating lore that generates intrigue and adds to the momentum. This is for when you want to add world lore, backstory, or history into the story, but you want to incorporate it in a way that feels natural and doesn't bore the reader. So use history and lore connected to a present-day rule or cost, a current decision, and a future stake. Lore shouldn't exist just to explain the world. Lore and history should exist to explain what a character does next. If a backstory reveal doesn't create a new cost, a new danger, or a new decision, then it's a history class and not momentum. Use the past to shape the present storyline and plot development. And some tips. This can be by slowly revealing it a bit at a time to generate intrigue, so using tiny present-day tells as breadcrumbs, such as a nickname the protagonist hates, a topic that makes them go cold, people treating them with fear or reverence, or an old symbol that makes them flinch. Those hints create curiosity, and then the full truth lands later as a payoff. You don't want to immediately answer every question. Suspense dies when the answers arrive before the audience wants them, so you want to make the readers want the information. And like I mentioned in my infodump video, mystery creates curiosity, which makes explanation feel like a reward. Attack on Titan uses past, present, and future reveals as pressure. You get small, unsettling hints, taboos, missing knowledge, and propaganda, and every new piece of history doesn't just answer a question. It reframes a current conflict, upgrades the stakes, and forces characters into harsher choices. And finally, rule number 7. Pacing and exposition. In any story, you don't want to introduce everything at once. Consequences are what lets the world unfold naturally. Sometimes you need to explain things to the reader instead of showing them, and I went over how to infodump in a different video, but here we'll be focusing on the pacing of cost and consequences, so showing, and not how to deliver the information through telling. Ideally, you want to start early on with the consequence, so that the audience immediately understand how the world works and is intrigued. Starting early on with the consequence does 2 things. First, it teaches the audience what kind of story this is, and it establishes a cost baseline, so later escalations feel earned instead of random, especially if there's going to be a tonal shift, like in the first episodes of Arcane. You want to prepare the reader for this sort of shift by showing a consequence, and keep in mind how to switch between tones. The switch has to be done early on so it doesn't turn off the readers. So, how to pace consequence world building without making it feel like an info dump. First, don't ever explain the system up front. Let the audience learn it through decisions, mistakes, and punishment, and clarify only what's needed for the next choice. Second, separate core and essential world building from flavor. Core rules are what affect survival, status, and strategy. Flavor is more like atmosphere. These are like the rituals, slang, temperature, and even smells of the world. We want to immerse the reader so that they can feel what it's like to live in this world, so that it doesn't just feel real to the creator, but to the audience too. But you need to separate core from flavor. Core keeps them engaged, flavor keeps them immersed. A proper mixture of both can give the world personality. So you want to treat the world like a character. And like characters, it has personality. These can be costs, tones, and atmospheres. And it pushes back. It impacts the cast and is impacted by them. Third, you want to remember not to answer every question immediately. Give the audience enough to orient them. Then hold back the piece that changes everything. Mystery isn't only for mystery stories. It's how you pull the reader forward. And finally, use dialogue to create friction. Exposition in dialogue works best when it's an argument, a warning, a negotiation, a threat, and not a lecture. And these can be tied directly to rules, costs, and consequences. So to summarize, you want to teach rules by showing the penalty. You want to turn the rule into pressure. You want to create costs by putting a daily price tag on living there. You want to make it personal, so how the world shapes the character and how the character's decisions affect the world and the plot. You want to have aftermath and permanence of consequences, so have the world remember. And when you integrate lore, it should affect the present and the future. And finally, the pacing and exposition tips we went over. And to wrap it up, remember these common mistakes. Full lore with no effect on decisions is backdrop and not world building. You want to teach cause, effect, and memory. Avoid shock value and spectacle that gets dropped, which breaks the memory principle. Remember that over-explaining kills suspense, so you don't want to spoon-feed the answers. And lastly, avoid creating a world with rules that exist only when the plot remembers them. And you can check out my other videos for how to info dump and how to create a cast of compelling characters.